Coming up on today's podcast, health, vitality, strength, and well-being. Basically what this podcast is all about. If you want it all in one easy to digest podcast, then you better carry on listening. I mean, how's that for a podcast promise?
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation.
Hello again. I seem to have recorded a few of these intros recently on my kitchen table rather than out and about, but that is where I am today. And today's podcast is all about waking the Qi. This podcast is all about energy. And the reason I started it is because you've probably heard the story before. I went to the jungle in 2014, contracted a tropical virus, came home, the virus went, but then I had a lot of post-viral symptoms that were very similar to long COVID. I ended up having 3 months off work and I spent most of the time in bed. And it's fair to say my energy levels were really very low. And I wanted to start a podcast on energy, firstly because I've been a broadcaster for 20 years and I thought it'd be good to combine my love of talking for a living with actually getting better, a bit of self-interest in there. But at the same time, I was interested in the deeper meaning of energy. Sure, I wanted more energy to live my life by, but I also am so fascinated by the unseen movements of energy between people around us, the Qi. That is so hard to put your finger on sometimes. Why is it that some people have such a profound effect on our energy levels, both positive and negative? How can we improve our own energy and our own Qi? Well, today I've got John Munro on the podcast. He is an acclaimed Qi Gong master. I've been fascinated in Qi Gong for a number of years now. He is the founder of Long White Cloud Qigong. He's the author of several, probably the best-selling books on Qigong on Amazon. And his passion is helping people feel the flow of Qi and apply this awareness to improving all aspects of day-to-day life. Qi is the energy of life. And this stuff is just so cool. And I took this Qigong 12 Rivers course a couple of years ago. John trained Aaron Collins Thomas, who's been a guest on this podcast before. And Aaron taught me the 12 Rivers. And I loved it. I mean, it's just so amazing. So I started off by asking John about the 12 rivers.
Yeah, so when I was putting that particular set of practices together, my aim was to focus on the organ meridians and have a set that really clearly worked with each of them. Because at that time, I was doing a lot of Qigong practice already myself, and I was researching and looking at other practices, and it was quite common when looking at the practices to find exercises that were good for this meridian, and an exercise that was good for another meridian, and an exercise that's good for a couple of meridians. But I didn't find anything where there was a set of practices that worked comprehensively through the full organ meridian system. And so that was my aim, was to put together a set that would do that. And by working through that full system, well, you're balancing all of those flows through all of your internal organs, and that then balances that whole energy system within your body. And as a result of that helps to balance some things internally, physically, with how those organs are functioning, but it also balances your emotions. Because that's also connected to the flow of energy in those meridians and those organs, and it balances your posture and so on. And so it's a really, well, I've been using that set for, oh goodness, I hate to think how long now. It's quite some time, and lots of people have done it, and lots of people have had amazing results working with those practices.
Honestly, it's so great. And I sometimes, especially, I've become far, obviously, this podcast is about energy, and I've become far more finely attuned to my own energy over the years. And sometimes I just sort of feel like I need that. I need some movement, but I don't need, an hour on the exercise bike sort of thing. It's amazing how I've become attuned to when I need it. And John, I've got a little tip for you later on that I think might make your 12 rivers practice even better, even though
really?
You are a celebrated Qigong master and I don't have a clue what I'm talking about. I've still got a tip that you might like.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
So we'll come back to you later on. You might say, Tony, that is the worst idea in the world. But it's something I had an idea and I've been trying it and I think it's good.
Okay, well, I look forward to hearing it.
Yeah, but let's just rewind then. So your mother taught you the Qigong techniques originally because she was learning it and she was a naturopath. And then you started to become more interested and then you started to study in Chinese medicine. Was all that because you were already working with people and working in health?
Yeah, to some degree, yes, because I was already doing some work in the area of health. And also I'd had my own health issues as I was growing up. I'd had a number of different issues. And so I had a really strong interest in health and ways to improve it, as well as simply just being fascinated by working with the energy. If you haven't really done anything where you've really felt your own energy before, when you do to begin with, it's something quite different to be able to feel it in such a tangible way. And that was fascinating to me. So it was a combination of both of those things, that fascination with the energy itself, and then a wider interest in working with health. Yeah.
And okay, so I mean, I think a lot of people that you speak to in this world do find that there's been something that's been going on in their own lives as well, which inspires them to get into it, which is quite interesting, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
And then you started to study in the Qigong. How long did it take you? Because you obviously had to learn these Chinese medicine techniques at the same time.
Yeah. So I spent 4 years studying Chinese medicine and Qigong initially. And that was my initial formal training. And then, of course, ever since then, you continue to learn, right? So I've continued to learn and study and research, and I've traveled all over the world and met all sorts of interesting people to continue to deepen my own knowledge.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. And when did you start to think this could be what I devote my life to here?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about what my Qigong journey has been like, because that kind of maybe explains this. So initially, my Qigong was very much about clinical practice. So actually, when I first started studying Qigong, there was still quite a lot of secrecy around Qigong. There's been an old tradition of there being quite a lot of secrecy and not teaching too many people, not letting them know your secrets, sort of thing. Maybe we won't go too much into that topic. We won't digress too much, but there's some interesting history there.
I think I read that in either in your book or another book.
Right. Yeah.
And especially with the rise of the Communist Party, that became even more so. Is that right? Or not?
Well, true. Well, that's a whole other issue, actually, in terms of the effect that had. But yeah, so there was still some of that when I was first learning. And so my teacher said, don't teach anyone. So initially when I learned, it was like, you practice this, but don't teach anyone, except in clinical application. So my early Qigong practice was all about using Qigong as a treatment, so both in terms of as a direct therapy, and then also recommending specific exercises to people to help them with their specific problems. And that was what I was allowed to do. So that's what I did.
And what sort of problems would they be?
Oh, everything. Everything. Anything from a little bit of indigestion to cancer. Anything you can imagine. And that was the start of my Qigong journey, purely clinical practice, and of course my own practice. And then a few years later, that teacher of mine, he out of the blue opened a public class teaching Qigong. I was like, hang on, I'm not supposed to teach anyone. And then it wasn't long before, because I would go along to the class, and then it wasn't long before he had me teaching the class, and then it wasn't long before he just didn't show up anymore. And so at that point, it was okay for me to start teaching people. And so I did. But then as my own Qigong journey continued, that my first teacher was also the grandmaster of a Kung Fu system. And so after some years of Chinese medicine and Qigong study and practice, I thought, well, maybe getting into the Kung Fu would help me to broaden my perspective and understanding of Qigong as well. I'd always been interested in martial arts since I was a kid, and I'd done different martial arts, but I'd never really got into Kung Fu style in a deep way, and one that had such a close association with Qigong and used it so integrally within it. And so I started doing Kung Fu. And so then my own practice developed, and as well as the health application, I became more interested in the martial application and essentially the high performance application of being able to do things that are a bit unusual. And so then I started teaching Kung Fu as well. And I put a lot of time, a lot of years focused on teaching Kung Fu as well as my clinical practice. Yeah. And then finally, after quite a while of that, after a while of developing some quite unusual skills and abilities, they don't seem so unusual anymore.
Well, what do you mean by unusual, by the way? I'm very, very interested by this.
Well, so just as you can use energy directly as a treatment for helping people who are ill to be heal themselves, you can also use it directly in the context of fighting. And that's an interesting application. And that's directly using the energy. Also on a physical level, you can use the Qigong practices to develop quite extraordinary strength and resilience and so on. So if you want something, now this is nothing to take too seriously or anything like that, it's just a little bit of fun. But if you want to see something interesting, I do have a YouTube channel that I made some years ago when I was traveling quite a lot, traveling around the world teaching, and it's called Jump on John. And in that, I have people all over the world, and they climb up on things and they jump off them onto my stomach.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, and I get some interesting reactions from that. So again, nothing to take too seriously, just a little bit of fun. And that's a fun application of that kind of physical resilience that you develop and is often applied to martial arts in terms of being able to withstand blows or to deliver a lot of power into strikes and so on. So that's an example of some of the sort of unusual abilities. But after some time, it's not that they're not still useful, but they're not so fascinating anymore because you've kind of like been there, done that to some extent. And so coming out of that, so again, initially starting with a focus on healing, then into the martial arts and physical performance. In more recent years, my focus has shifted much more to, you could consider it the philosophical application of Qigong, which is really understanding yourself better, understanding the world around you better, understanding your interaction with the world around you and with other people better, and those big patterns within our lives. And that's been the evolution of my study and practice. And I guess to link that back around, well, as it so happens, these are the three main historical applications of Qigong. If you look at the ways it's been used over thousands of years, generally it's fallen into these three areas: for health, for martial arts, and for spiritual or philosophical pursuits. And it just so happened that naturally my own path evolved in that way.
Right.
So coming back around to your initial question of, when did I decide this was, kind of going to be the thing that I did? It has been a big part of what I've done right from when I initially studied it. It was a big part of my clinical practice. It was a big part of my Kung Fu teaching. And then eventually it became the main thing where, basically everything's focused on Qigong now. So it was always a big part, and it's grown into my main focus over time.
Yeah. Interrupting this podcast for one moment to let you know that it is brought to you by the shortcut to more calm and more connectedness, Sensate, who are my podcast partners for this month. And not only that, by the way, if you're someone who wears an Oura ring, I think you can increase your heart rate variability using Sensate as well. It's a genius device. You hang it around your neck and it, through sort of conduction techniques, makes your whole body vibrate. And you listen to a soundtrack as well. And what it does is fairly incredible at getting you into a different place quite quickly. There is loads of science behind it. You can do 10-minute sessions, 20-minute sessions. You do longer if you want. But, 20 minutes for me is plenty long enough to get into a very good state of relaxation. It's nice before bed, but in my experience, if you do it an hour before bed, you'll just drop off there and then. So you need to make sure you do it at exactly the right moment, because it is really strong at supporting your stress response system. And let's face it, we all need a bit of that at the moment. If you go to getsensate.com/Tony Wrighton, you can get 10% off by using the code Tony. That is getsensate.com/Tony Wrighton. Use the code Tony and get 10% off. It really does work well. And it's sort of a shortcut to reducing stress and anxiety and staying cool, calm, and connected. And I think one of the great things about this thing is that there's a lot of gadgets and tech advances in the biohacking world which cost a lot. This is, it's a bit of an investment, but it's not a new mortgage. So getsensate.com/Tony Wright and use the code Tony for 10% off. Now, back to the show. So, and if we look at some of the ways that Qigong can help people, it's interesting you talked about relating to the world. I certainly find I live a lot of my life in my head. I'm very sort of type A, busy, slightly addicted to technology and find it hard to put it down. And I feel like when I do Qigong, especially if I do it outside, it immediately helps me get out of my head and switch on my senses, my visual sense, my audio sense, my kinesthetic sense, aware of the sounds of the trees and so on in a way that I just wasn't before. Is that one of the things that you mean when you're talking about becoming aware of the world around you?
Yeah, absolutely. At a simple level, that's the start of it. And then as you continue, your perception of that becomes more nuanced. You become more sensitive and aware of some of the subtlety of those relationships.
Yeah.
In Qigong, we often talk about using three main tools as part of our Qigong practice. And that is the mind, the body, and the breath. And if we have a tendency to be stuck in too much in one or the other, through our Qigong practice, we create a harmony between these. And so if we have a tendency to be stuck in our head, we learn to connect more to our body. And our breath, looping back to something you said earlier, plays a key role in that, about helping us to find that harmony between our mind and our body and really connect and experience what's going on and direct what's going on within our body and our energy.
Yeah. And with the breath, do you think a lot of us just simply don't breathe deeply enough?
Yes, I think that's true for a lot of people. A lot of people don't breathe deeply enough. And certainly learning to breathe deeply, fully, and freely is a great start. And hopefully that's something you do fairly early as you start to explore Qigong practice. And then as you continue, that becomes more nuanced. And there's lots of fine details in the use of the breath for directing your energy as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I read James Nestor's book, Breath. I don't know if you've read it. It's absolutely
yeah, I have read that one.
Yeah, and he's been on this podcast as well. And I wear one of these Oura rings, and I started doing one of the breathing techniques. Have you seen these before?
No.
They measure your heart rate variability, sleep, and exercise, and so on, and respiratory rate as well.
Right.
And quite good, by the way, for spotting if you've got COVID way in advance of doing a test.
Yeah, I bet.
It's quite helpful. But with the James Nestor techniques, my heart rate variability spikes massively when I'm doing the techniques. And I haven't tested it with Qigong, but I'm sure it's the same. It just feels like it's so good for balancing my nervous system and helping my heart rate sort of calm itself whilst being a gentle exercise. I'm sure it's probably doing some good there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one of the big things with Qigong is, yes, it is gentle exercise, but because the focus of it's a bit different, a lot of it is focused on subtly working with those internal functions, things like our heart rate, the function of our organs, our blood pressure, in some quite subtle ways.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one of the things I'm really interested in is that there seems to be, if you follow, for example, yin yoga, there's and my wife is a yin yoga teacher, so I know this. There are basically a certain amount of moves, and that's it. But with Qigong, there's so many different variations, which I love, because actually it means it's never going to get boring, and there's always something different to explore. Why are there so many different variations?
Yeah, I mean, there's literally thousands of styles of Qigong. And a big part of that is that it's gone through a long process of evolution through its time in China and then eventually spreading out to the rest of the world. And different teachers had their own take on different practices, and so they shaped them in different ways. And they also applied them in different ways. I mentioned earlier those three main areas of health, high performance or the martial arts, and then the spiritual or philosophical applications. Because they were applying them in many ways, in quite practical ways. It wasn't just, I'm going to do it and see what happens. They really wanted a result. If you're doing it for health, you want there to be a benefit to your health. If you're doing it in the martial arts, by golly, you really want some clear results there for those situations, if you ever have real conflict. And so because of this practical application, they really came up with a lot of tools. As people were working on different areas that they were trying to work with, if you go into someone who's a real car buff or something, and you look at all the specialized tools that they have in their garage, and it's like they've got a tool for everything.
Yeah.
Whereas, other people might just have a little handyman's box and they've got a hammer and they've got a screwdriver and that's it. Qigong developed by applying to all these different things. They came up with different tools that would be useful in different ways. Now, that's not to say that you need to have all of those different tools. You might find that being the handyman with your little toolbox is plenty, and that does everything that you need. Just because there's thousands of practices out there doesn't mean you need to do them all. Just a few will often give you the benefits that you want. But it's wonderful to have all of those thousands of practices that you can explore if you want to.
Yeah. And those, you mentioned the health and the high performance and the philosophical element. I think that very much sums up some of the different areas that we focus on this podcast.
Right.
And I know the areas that people who listen are interested in. So if someone let's take health first. If someone's interested in improving this health, and I know it's very broad brush and very generalized, and you're welcome to focus in on something specific, but what might they be interested in Qigong? What could they do specifically? Is there something they could try out, or is there something they could do some more research into in terms of their health and the practice of Qigong?
Yeah. Well, almost every Qigong practice will have at least some health benefit, but the question is, okay, what's going to be a really good place to start? Working with your breath is a great place to start, and learning how to breathe deeply and freely. If people are interested, I have a free little course on breathing. It's called The Complete Natural Breath, which if they want to check that out on our website, and that's a good place to start to learn how to breathe freely and deeply. And then moving on beyond that, I would say the 12 Rivers practice is a really good one. It's quite sophisticated. There's a little bit involved in learning it, but in terms of getting some really clear, significant health benefits, it's a great practice.
Yeah. Well, I was just on holiday in the last couple of weeks, and we were in Thailand, which was lovely because the temperature was just so great to do a bit of Qigong outside. I've got a feeling that some of the other hotel guests thought that some of my 12 Rivers moves looked a little bit odd, but I didn't care because I was enjoying life.
Great, yeah.
Especially this one. What's this one?
It's probably Crane Looks Behind, it sounds like. Yeah, Crane Looks Behind.
I love that one. That one just feels so good.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. So they correspond, so that the crane, a lot of the moves correspond to animals, don't they? Why is that?
That's right. Yeah, well, so the earliest origins of Qigong, the origins of Qigong back go back between 5,000 and 8,000 years, and it's so long ago that we can't really point to there was one smart person who came up with Qi Gong, and it's not like that. It's we know roughly what the origins looked like. And part of those origins was the common Chinese people. They would work hard all day, and for them, hard work meant working in the fields and often rice paddies. So it meant that they got wet, and they would come home at night, and so they'd be cold and wet and tired. And as a result of that, they would get sick, and they would often also get achy joints and pains in their joints. This was quite common from their conditions. And they discovered that if they came home and they danced first before they then went and rested, that they didn't get sick as often, that they didn't have as many aches and pains. And so a lot of those dancers were shamanic dancers. They were dancers copying animals. And those are some of the earliest origins of Qigong, these dancers copying animals. What then happened is, as they observed the effect of these dances, they noticed that when you dance like one animal, you got certain results that helped with some things in your body. If you danced copying another animal, it gave you some different results, helping other things in your body. And so through this process of observation, they started to refine their understanding of how moving in different ways moved their energy in different ways and gave them different benefits. And that became very refined over time. But those are the earliest starting points. And then it developed into a very sophisticated system of understanding, all of the meridians and the points for acupuncture and all of the energy systems within the body.
And bearing that in mind, what you just said, does it almost sort of frustrate you? I mean, you could call it a technology that's been developed over thousands of years and refined by generations of people. And so I sometimes feel, and it's not just Qigong, but there are a certain amount of ancient practices that perhaps we don't give, and you could say this about traditional Chinese medicine as well. We don't give the respect that it deserves simply because so many generations of people have put their life's work and thought into this discipline.
Yeah, I think the big thing is, or in my perspective, is that we want Qigong to be a living art. And, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make them drink. So if people aren't interested, they're not interested. You can't make people recognize the value in something. But those who do and give it a try often really notice those benefits, and then they begin to appreciate them. And as long as we have a community of people who continue to practice and continue to enjoy those benefits, it keeps those practices alive. It means that we can use them in relevant ways for us in our lives today. So it doesn't matter if not everyone knows them and understands them. What matters is that some of us do. And the more of us that do, people tend to talk about it with their friends anyway. And so particularly in the West right now, awareness of Qigong is growing really rapidly.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, to people who haven't really been around it too much, it might seem like, not that many people know about Qigong. Well, a whole lot more people know about Qigong than did 10 years ago.
Wow.
And then a whole lot more than 20 years ago. It's the awareness is growing really rapidly as more people are discovering those benefits.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to know my suggestion for 12 Rivers?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, of course, it might be brilliant.
Well, you probably thought of it already. But what I love about 12 Rivers is that each move corresponds to, there's a different move, and it corresponds to a time of day, and it corresponds to a part of the body as well. It's just so brilliant. And there's something else. Is that?
To emotions.
Yeah, to emotions. Okay.
Because that relates to the organs. There's different relationship with emotions and organs. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's just, it's as you can tell, I'm a big fan. But anyway, when I do it outside, I started, especially when it's a sunny day, I started to try moving round in a circle with the 12 rivers, facing the place where the sun would be that corresponds to the time of day that you do the move.
I see.
Which I actually sort of helped me plug further into the natural world outside me and get out of my head. Now, what do you, be honest, John, what do you think of that idea?
That's an interesting idea. Some Qigong practices do make specific use of that concept. Maybe not quite in the way that you've put it together. You've put it together in your own sort of way, which is great. And that's part of part of a living practice means that we apply principles in a way that works for us, right? And some Qigong practices do specifically make use of facing in different directions because the energy, we're all interacting with the energy of the earth all the time, right? Yeah. And that energy is actually a little bit different from different directions. And so some Qigong practices make specific use of that. And so that's an interesting idea to apply that to maybe how you work with the 12 Rivers practice as well.
Yeah. No, it's worked for me. But anyway, I do feel now, obviously I did this course a couple of years ago with Aaron, who you've trained. And so you trained Aaron in the 12 Rivers and he trained me. And it has lasted, I really do it all the time.
Cool.
Perhaps it's time for the next step now? What is the next step in my Qigong learning? What do you offer, and what might be a good idea for me to do next?
Yeah. So the next practice, if you're wanting to take on, an individual practice or set of practices, is probably the Between Heaven and Earth practice.
Okay.
And that is, so the 12 Rivers works with the organ meridians. The Between Heaven and Earth practice works with the extraordinary meridians, which sounds like a cool name. They're extraordinary.
Yeah.
Which function quite differently than the organ meridians. So an analogy for the organ meridians is that they're like rivers that flow through our body and they carry the energy like a river. If you think, a river always flows to somewhere and it always ends up in a lake or in an ocean, right? Eventually that's where it goes. That water then pools, it's gathered. So within our body, we call where our energy gathers, we call this a dantian. That's our ocean of energy. The extraordinary meridians are the ocean currents. So it's the same energy, but it's at a different phase of its activity. And so if you've got really comfortable working with those organ meridians, those rivers, the next thing is to start to work with the dantian and with the ocean currents. And that opens up some really interesting, fascinating aspects of your practice, because as your ocean currents, your extraordinary meridians start to flow more strongly, this naturally starts to fill and strengthen your energy field. And if you go back to that natural that analogy from nature, if you think of those ocean currents and the way that they affect the weather, a lot of our weather actually comes from the energy moving within the ocean, the heat moving within the ocean, and the way this evaporates and creates the clouds and so on. And so a natural result of the Between Heaven and Earth practice is we start to strengthen our energy field, which then leads to a whole new layer of interaction with the world around you.
Oh, wow.
So I'd say that would be the next practice for you to sort of work on if you're feeling ready for the next step.
Yeah.
In terms of what I offer, at the moment, I do a lot of quite comprehensive training. So I teach people courses that run for like 4 months at a time.
Yeah.
And they can learn a whole lot of practices all together there. And so the one that the 12 Rivers and the Between Heaven and Earth practices are in, it's in a set of practices called the Small Universe Qigong. And so in those, we do, there's a set called Waking the Qi, 12 Rivers, Between Heaven and Earth, Enter the Flow. And we do some other practices called Zhangchuan, and we do meditation and breath work and so on. And that we do that all together. So that might be a bit too big of a step. You might want to just focus just on the Between Heaven and Earth.
You never know, John. I might be there. I might be there with you. Yeah, I'd love. I feel at some point I'd love to do that. That your course, your 4-month course. That'd be great. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. No, obviously this podcast is all about energy. So, when you start to talk about the movements of energy and tuning into your energy fields more, that's just, this podcast came about because I contracted a tropical virus and I didn't have any energy. So on a simple level, I wanted to boost my energy. But on a much deeper level, I'm fascinated in the movements of energy, some of which we understand and some which we don't. And I feel Qi Gong, that there's some, unlocks some of the secrets of that.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah.
Gives some fascinating insights.
Definitely. Now, John, I really do appreciate you having recorded this podcast, because I know that it's actually quite late in New Zealand, and I feel very bad about that, because had I known, we would have rearranged for an earlier time for you. So thank you so much for staying up late. You're going to have to do 20 minutes of balancing, calming Qigong to get yourself ready for bed after this.
Yeah, I'll manage.
Oh, good. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Anyway, and what is, let me ask you these questions that I ask everyone then. What is one book that you would recommend and one tip for living with more energy?
Sure. I'll recommend 2 books. Because one, I'll recommend my own, but that would seem silly to just recommend my own. I'll recommend someone else's as well. Yeah. So a book of mine that you might like to look at, it's called Qi Gong Foundation Practices. And that lays out some really simple theory of Qigong and how it works. And it also gives a description of the 12 rivers practices that we've been talking about. So as a little bit of an introduction to Qigong, it's a pretty good starting place.
Yeah. I think that's the one I've read. I'm not sure.
Could well be. Yeah. Could well be. Yeah. Another one that's quite good if you're interested in some of the bigger patterns of energy in your life. There's a book called Wood Becomes Water. And it's a book about the 5 elements, which is a part of Chinese philosophy that helps us to understand some of the big patterns of energy and transitions in our lives. And then in terms of what was the other question about?
The tip for living with more energy and vitality. That's what this podcast is all about. So what is one tip for living with more energy?
I would say, see if you can really tap into your energy in a very literal sense. And Qigong is a great tool for doing that, of course. But see if you can learn to have a sense of the energy within your body, a real physical, tangible sense of that. And that will give you a great guide as you develop that sense to understand much more fully how you're responding to what's going on around you in your life. And you'll be able to monitor what's going on and maybe then make some better decisions about what helps to increase your energy, what helps to make your energy vital and strong. And you'll be able to recognize more easily those things that maybe deplete your energy. But the first thing is to tune into it in a very real, tangible way.
Yeah. I did some work in China a few years ago, and we were working 12 hours a day. We were presenting a sporting event from sort of midday till midnight every day. And I loved seeing people would seem to do Qigong everywhere, on street corners, in parks, wherever. They would just be busting out a few moves all over the place. And then one night I went outside to take a bit of a break about 10 o'clock at night. There was an old man who just set up outside this sort of venue where we were hosting a pool tournament and doing an incredibly powerful, measured set of Qigong moves, which, talk about tapping into his energy. He really was. It was amazing to watch and really inspiring, actually. And didn't need anywhere fancy to do it, just on the pavement.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Absolutely.
Yeah. Good stuff, John. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Where can people find out more about you?
If you go on Long White Cloud Qigong.com, so Qigong is spelled Qigong. That's the bit that's probably hard to spell. Long White Cloud. Hopefully everyone can spell that. So Long White Cloud Qigong.com, and you can see there's videos of Qigong practices that you can follow along with there, including the 12 rivers in between heaven and earth that we've talked about. There's links to the free courses and other courses. There's articles. There's all sorts of things there if you're interested in learning a bit more about Qigong.
Brilliant. I've just realized I've been saying it wrong as well, haven't I? It's Qigong, not Qigong.
Look, there's different pronunciations because in different parts of China, they have a different accent on how they pronounce it. So I don't think you should feel too self-conscious about, saying it a little bit different, because you might be saying it exactly the way they say it in some region in China,
Great. Good. Okay, John, lovely to talk to you. We'll speak again soon, and thanks for today. Really good to talk to you.
Great. Thanks, Tony.
That is it for today's podcast. I feel like my Qi is well and truly woken. I hope you have a terrific week. Thanks as always for listening to Zestology. Today's podcast partner is getsensate.com/Tony Wrighton for all the latest on Sensate to help keep you cool and calm and collected. This is the pebble-shaped device that hangs around your neck and helps you de-stress. It is a groundbreaking innovation in wellness technology, and if you use the code TONY, you will get a nice chunk of change off. Okay, so it is getsensate.com/Tony Wrighton. This is stress relief technology for meditation and relaxation, and use the code TONY for a nice chunk of change off. Plenty more over on that site. As always, thank you for listening to Zestology, and I'll see you next week.